Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you might be. It is noon here in Massachusetts, and I'm delighted to see all of you. Welcome to our latest industry coffee chat featuring talent leaders. I'm Lisa Himmelman, the Assistant Director of Alumni Engagement. And before we get started with our session, I just have some light housekeeping items I'd like to go over. So as you can see, we're hosting today's session in a meeting style, so feel free to keep your camera on or turn it off, whichever is your preference. We will be recording today's session and distributing it to all who registered. You will notice that you're currently muted, and we do ask that you remain muted when you're not speaking. This is meant to be an interactive session though, so everyone here will have the opportunity to raise hands and go off mute to ask questions and have discussion later in the session. We also invite you to use the chat for this purpose, and we will be moderating the chat. We have closed captioning available for the session, so if you would like to see the captions, please click on the CC/live transcript button, then click on Show Subtitle. You can turn off subtitles by clicking on Live Transcript, then click Hide Subtitle. And finally, we'd really love to get a sense of who's joining us today. So if you could please put into the chat your HGSE degree, your program or concentration, and where you're located. And if you want to share your current role, that would be great. And so now on to the good part. I am thrilled to introduce our wonderful facilitator, Ryan Romaneski, EDM class of 2013, who is an HGSE Alumni Council member and the Senior Director of Talent and Teamwork at Ednovate. Ryan is joined by our panelists, Rebecca Begetsing, EDM class of 2010, Cornelius Lee, EDM class of 2015, and Rachel Parton, EDM class of 2013. So Ryan, on to you.
Great, thanks, Lisa. It's great to see so many faces here and a number of familiar faces. Thanks so much for being here today. I'm really excited for the conversation and for the questions that you all will have for this group. I'm, as Lisa mentioned, I'm Ryan Romaneski. I'm the Senior Director of Talent and Teamwork with Ednovate. We're a charter high school network in Southern California. Just a little bit of my background. I started out as a middle school teacher right out of undergrad. I spent 5 years in the classroom, what I used to refer to as the 5 hardest years of my life until I worked in education during COVID, but that's another panel. And then, I left education for 10 years. I didn't really know what I wanted to do. I didn't really know where I fit. I knew I didn't want to be in the classroom anymore. And I didn't really know that jobs like the job I have now or the job that our panelists have really existed. So I spent 10 years doing other things and then came back to education actually through HGSE. While I was at HGSE, I got connected with a fellowship program called Education Pioneers. That took me to Boston Public Schools, where I worked in the central office before moving to California to do some work at ed nonprofits, and then eventually moved my way back into school operator, this time through a charter network called KIP, where I was for 5 years before I transitioned into my current role. Part of why I'm so passionate about this work, one is I just think that this is a really interesting time for the education talent landscape, which we'll hear a lot about here in the next few minutes. And because I think that there's can be such a gap in knowledge and information around like what's going on out in the hiring and talent landscape generally. So hoping to help fill some of those gaps for the folks on this call. Really excited to introduce you to the panelists. I'm going to let them take a minute just to introduce themselves, share a little bit about their own journey to today before we jump in. And I'll start with Rebecca.
Everyone, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. I'm Rebecca Begetsing. I'm class of 2010. I did the Ed Policy Management program at HGSE. It is such a treat to be here. I adore HGSE and everyone affiliated with it. And so it's really a delight in my day to do this. Thank you, Ryan, for the opportunity. So yeah, I'm based in the San Francisco Bay Area. Similar to Ryan, I started out my career teaching. I taught for 5 years in Los Angeles, and then I made my way into the education nonprofit space. So I spent a couple years at Teach for America doing alumni affairs work, and then went to HGSE to learn more about all things education reform, and came out of it and decided to venture further into the talent space. So actually went back to Teach for America and worked on the human assets team for several years, and then shifted to One Goal, which is a college access, or originally it was a college access. It's evolved a little bit, but worked for One Goal for a number of years. And presently I work for a company called Mindshare Partners. We're a small nonprofit consulting and advising firm, and we advise on workplace mental health. And we also do advocacy around that as well. And, I think the through line for me through all of this has been about just a deep interest in like human development, and how do we develop little people and big people and support them to be at their best, whether that's in the classroom or in the workplace. And that's also certainly what kind of led me into the workplace mental health space. So one of the themes that I have seen throughout my time is just issues around burnout and compassion fatigue, and how do you sustain this really important work. And it was something that I also struggled with myself. And so thinking about how to really create really nurturing healthy work environments for everyone, and education is certainly such an important sector to do that in. So that's a little bit about my story.
Thanks, Rebecca. Let's go to Rachel next. You're next on my screen.
All right, sounds good. Hi, everyone. I am Rachel Parton, EDM class of 2013, as Lisa shared. I began my career in 2007 as a writer for then Harvard President Drew Gilpin Faust, and I worked my way up over 6 years in her office, managing Harvard's presidential communications team. In my last 2 years at Harvard, I attended the higher ed master's program at HGSE. And when I graduated in 2013, I moved back to my hometown of Portland, Oregon, where I still live. The educational landscape here is much, much smaller than in Boston. And so I chose to capitalize on my transferable skills, and I joined an international full service law firm in a marketing and business development role. Which meant essentially I was managing that firm's relationships with its largest clients. But after about 4 years of that, I really missed mission-driven work. And so I was recruited in 2017 to Isaacson Miller, which was an executive search firm based in Boston. And at that time, I was actually the firm's first fully remote employee, which was quite the groundbreaking experience. But of course, now almost all of that firm's employees are fully remote, I think. And then 3 years ago, I joined my current firm, Talent Citizen, where I manage the advancement practice. So Talent Citizen is an executive search firm that works across the mission-driven sector to recruit and place executives at organizations that are working to affect social change, be that in education, philanthropy, evaluation and research. We do a lot actually with refugee, immigration, and civil rights. So basically for the last 7 years, I've been an executive recruiter focusing primarily in the advancement space. So I place fundraising and communications executives at nonprofits across the country. So in a nutshell, I'd say I'm hired by educational organizations when they have an opening to fill, usually at the director level, all the way up to vice presidents, presidents, CEOs. And then I run national searches to build candidate pools and manage interviewing and hiring processes.
Thanks, Rachel. And Cornelius, why don't you close this out?
Great, thanks. Much like Rebecca, whenever I'm in a HGSE space, I feel like it's a bit of a homecoming. So really appreciative to be with y'all today. Cornelius Lee, I go by the he, him series of pronouns. And for fun, I like to throw in adjectives. So my adjectives are fierce, fabulous, and focus. I also really like alliteration. I used to be a former English teacher. And I start off by how I identify, especially with talent work. I think that's really important to start with humanity first. So identify as a queer Black person. And I've had to navigate those identities both personally and professionally, and sometimes had to negotiate and adapt and assimilate some of those identities. So I think that's really important when we talk about talent is humanity and identity. I'm a school leadership program class of 2015, and I'm currently the vice president of talent for an organization called Equitable Facilities Fund. And like Ryan said, as I graduated from Huxley and found out how many different pockets of the education sector existed, I would have never thought that years ago, as a classroom teacher, that now I would end up working for an organization that makes affordable financing for charter school facilities funding. And so it is very, very niche. And when I think about like tangible equity, lowering the cost for facilities funding for schools means they get to put that money back into classrooms. And so it's been really motivating to do this sort of work. But I started off as a classroom teacher many years ago, actually in my hometown where I grew up in Plano, Texas. And then eventually made my way to Chicago via Teach for America, and then became a school leader. And what I realized is that I was obsessed with building culture and developing teachers. And I was like less obsessed with some of the other parts related to being a principal. So that led me to go more in the leadership development space where I worked in various nonprofits, and then wanted to find the intersection between DEI and talent. I don't see those things as separate from each other. I see them as very interrelated. And so that led me to an organization called Promise 54, where I was a partner at that firm, and Promise 54 provided client services along the sort of DEI and talent continuum, consultative services. And so really helped that organization kind of get their sea legs for about 6 years until making a recent transition at the end of 2023 to Equitable Facilities Fund. So that's a bit about me. I like to say I'm a kind of a gumbo pot mixed with Midwestern sensibility. Got the Southerner and the Midwesterner all together.
Thanks, Cornelius, and thanks everyone. We'll jump in with the first question. And for folks joining the call, welcome. We're gonna probably spend about 25 to 30 minutes on some questions that I've got to get us started, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. So if you do have questions, though, as Lisa said, please feel free to, you can also put them in the chat in the meantime. Just to kick us off, what, you all represent such a diverse swath of the talent kind of landscape, working in higher education and K-12, working outside of like the kind of core education in Rebecca's case. What is one word you would use to describe the talent landscape today, and why? And let's go in reverse order. We'll start with Cornelius.
So a word I think of is reimagining, and I'm a glass half full person, and so I like to see the positives of how things are trending, and I've observed organizations making really big investment. As a consultant, I got to work with a number of organizations, and I saw over the span of my time at Promise 54, at the beginning of my time there, not necessarily a reticence to fund like a talent arm in an organization, but it was really thought of as like talent acquisition. And so it's like if we had a talent acquisition person to think of recruitment and selection, and that's really how talent was thought of in a lot of organizations. And I saw over time is that folks saw that bringing people in wasn't just enough. So thinking about bringing in a diversity of folks, but then not really understanding the full talent life cycle. Like, how do you take care of these folks? How do you differentiate talent systems? So performance management, compensation, career development. This was really important in not only bringing in folks, but retaining them. And so 6 years later, I'm now seeing organizations hire like chief talent officers or really thinking more robust about performance development and performance management, and having whole positions dedicated to that in their organization. So I really see that trending more. The talent acquisition will always be important, but I see organizations sort of reimagining what they believe talent is, and hiring either FTEs or putting more sort of emphasis and dollars into and resources into the entire talent life cycle. Ryan, I think you're on mute, at least for me.
Oh, sorry. You know, how many years into Zoom are we? And I'm still on mute. Rachel, how about you? From, you know, where you sit, kind of looking at either, you know, internally in your own organization or in the organizations with which you work.
Yeah, I think echoing some of what Cornelia said, the first word that came to mind was precarious, but I thought, why did that word come to mind? And so I think it's really more that it's evolving. And a lot of that has to do with sort of expectations that changed during the pandemic, but also generational. I think expectations are changing in the workplace. And so there's retention implications, to Cornelius's point, different expectations around healthy workplace culture, and expectations for really needing to see growth over time for talented individuals in an organization. And that has placed some strain on educational institutions, which are often place-based. And so there's a lot of change around, you know, hybrid, remote, in-person work that I think, especially for educational institutions, has led to a lot of evolution in how they manage the talent landscape.
Rich, Rebecca, what about you?
Yeah, I would sort of plus one to both what Cornelius and Rachel said. I had the word evolving in my mind as well, but I could also say sort of redefining. I think particularly ever since the pandemic, there's been a renegotiation of what employees expect of employers, and which is a positive thing, I think, is employees are really looking for more. They're looking for more work-life balance. They're looking for more support and development. I think we've also seen the trend of people wanting to do really meaningful work for them, right? So no longer are they going to stay in the job that they hate, but they're really going to try and do something that's really purposeful with their time. And so I think we're just in this, you know, looking within education, but broadly just across all sectors of like redefining work. Like, what does work mean? What does it mean for us, sort of society? And what is that negotiation between employees and employers? And I think we're in that process of trying to shake that out, which is a bit of a messy process. I think when you look at, you know, some of the headlines and the tensions around returning to work or not returning to work, or the office, and, you know, things like that. So, yeah, I think it's an interesting time to think about talent.
Yeah, thanks, Rebecca. Just a quick follow-up. What are there any of those changes, any of that evolution that you feel, in any of that disruption that you feel will have particularly lasting impacts from where you sit? I mean, you know, in some ways you're kind of a model. You left education, you know, you know, more traditional, like core educational organization during this time of disruption. What do you feel some of the lasting impacts might be?
Yeah, I think in some ways it's like, I hope there will be lasting impacts. I mean, I hope that we've seen the shift to, for example, even like office work versus remote work, if you're in a place that you're able to do that, right? I think one of the things is like, can we shift to where there's more greater trust in employees, right? It doesn't matter where you get the work done, right? That it matters like what you're accomplishing. And so giving more flexibility there. So I do think when it comes to well-being, like as much flexibility that we can give employees, the better. So would like to see that trend continue, although again, there's this sort of push and pull with it right now. I think there's a lot of focus on retention, which is like, how do we support our people and what do they need in that development? So I hope that that continues to be, you know, front and center. Again, I think there's some research around kind of once the pandemic settled, people are like, okay, let's get back to normal and let's not put all the emphasis into DEI or talent development. And so my hope is that we don't swing back that way, but we just continue to have initiatives and things that support employees in their development. And then again, I think that looks also very, I think the education space is also very unique in its own, right? It has its own constraints, it has its own things around, can not every situation or job can be remote, right? Like you have to be in person. So I think it's how do we support, teachers and leaders, and what does that look like within education as well?
Thanks, Rebecca. Cornelius, anything you'd add?
Yeah, I would say like to the disruption piece, and this is like to trends I'm seeing, it reminds me of what Rachel said, is that I think the pandemic, like there's natural change that happens over time, and then the pandemic was like a forcing mechanism that we saw. So I think things were sort of forced to change. And um like what I've seen, at least in my organization, is a big generational divide. Like you have like folks that are in their earlier 20s to folks that are, in their 60s. And I think the upcoming generation and this sort of what they like, you're hearing words used that I think some of the folks that maybe are of a different generation, like mental health, was something that they never really heard talked about at work. I was talking to one employee. I would say she's on the other side of it, a bit more seasoned in her career, and we were talking about psychological safety, and it's just something she just hadn't thought of to talk about at work. But our younger employees, they're always talking about psychological safety and mental health and culture, and to have these folks actually be in the same workplace setting, working alongside of each other, being managed and reporting into each other, has been like just like really fascinating in terms of how an organization has to be responsive to that. I think you cannot be. I think some organizations were like, well, we'll just kind of figure it out. But it's like, no, organizations do have to like invest in sort of figuring out some of these differences, especially for younger career professionals that we do actually want to see. I think I'm a fan of grow your own, right? That means you have to retain them and be responsive to them. And just because they're more junior, I see some senior folks like, oh, well, they just kind of cut their teeth like we did. And what I'm saying now, they will leave, like they're not going to stick around. I think I'm still part of a generation that was cutting your teeth. And I'm like, okay, this is not great, but I got to spend some time in there to really grow a reputation, get social capital. And I think that younger folks are kind of bucking against that and saying, no, I don't want to do that. I should be treated with respect because I'm a human and I exist here, and I shouldn't have to like cut my teeth, so to say, in ways that other folks I think are more used to.
Thanks. Yeah, you all kind of spoke of the, shifts towards prioritizing things like culture, things like retention. What are some of the challenges that you think organizations are having? Cornelius, you sort of began to touch on this with maybe sort of differences in expectations based on, maybe years of experience. What are some of the other challenges that organizations are facing in their talent work right now, whether it's recruitment, selection, retention, whatever? What are some other challenges that you think folks are seeing? Cornelius, do you want to kick us off? And then we'll go to Rachel.
So I think that the work I did at Promise 54 really thought about many different dimensions of culture in the talent life cycle. And organizations have put a lot of resources into the talent acquisition, especially after big events like George Floyd and some other things that, racial unrest. And so there's a big push for racial equity on the front end, like windows and mirrors, right? If you think of an organization as a house, they were really focused on the windows work. So like, let's go outside of the organization and find Black and brown people and bring them in. And that's going to kind of solve some of these issues. But some of the mirror work wasn't happening. And so it wasn't looking internal to systems and saying, okay, then if we're going to bring in different folks, how do we act differently? And then organizations were like, uh-oh, we're not retaining these folks, or there's real cultural fissures because we went from maybe a more homogenous setting, whether that be racially or otherwise, And then when we have difference, we're not ready for that difference because there's been some shaking of the boat, so to say. So what I've seen is now organizations start to think more about culture, not as this like side piece, like this, we do a culture PD, once a quarter, and that's about it. But we really are investing real resources into development and to career progression. We're defining that. We're making systems equitable, transparent, and clear. No longer can like compensation is a big one, right? Like the level of visibility of that, compensation is not like a lot of legality around what you can share other than people's like hard salaries, which we know in public education, you actually can see some of that. But even what people are getting paid, how they're getting paid, what's the transparency around that? How are people getting developed? And they want to know that. And so I'm seeing organizations either scramble to kind of get that together. Some have been a bit more intentional about it, but it retains people, especially in a market where it's hard to draw people to some organizations. You don't want to lose them. And so I do see more organizations trying to retain and grow their own. I see some organizations like ours, we have a program where we realize we were having trouble. Finances traditionally doesn't get a lot of at least racial diversity and gender diversity. So it can be very white, very male driven. And we weren't finding candidates for our roles that were diverse along gender and racial lines. So we started a program with about 5 organizations that are like ours, just dedicated to people graduating from college in finance. And so, but that's a big time investment. It's a big financial investment, but our big bet is that these folks, and some of them we have a class of them making it through organizations, they get placed, and we're starting to see the return on investment. I think with you got to play the long game. Here it's like, okay, we want some quick wins, but that's like a longer term investment is to start this program. And we're already starting to see a couple classes in the return on investment in organizations, our finance kind of cadre that we're with, they're starting to look a lot more diverse at the junior level because of this program.
Thanks, Cornelius. Rachel, what about you? What are you seeing?
When I think about challenges in sort of recruiting and hiring, I think probably because I work nationally, I see a real disadvantage to institutions that are located in places where legislation is being passed that's maybe not aligned with that institution's mission. And so it can place those institutions at a real recruiting disadvantage. I hear often from people I reach out to that if they are a person with a uterus, or if they or their family members are anything other than white and heterosexual, they do not feel safe living in certain places, especially right now. And so that really places those institutions that are in those places at a disadvantage when they're trying to recruit talent.
Thanks, Rachel. Rebecca, anything you would add?
So I think that, yeah, that hit on kind of some of the key challenges that I think, I guess the only thing I'd add is, I think what happened with the Great Resignation is there was just a lot more movement, and I think it's starting to settle, but I think that movement has continued. I think similar to what Cornelius was saying is like people are willing to make a shift. They're willing to move if they're not happy. And so I think from the recruitment standpoint of like how do we not only attract in, but then keep? And so I think it's sort of up the ante on our need to do that well, right? So not just bring in, but also have all of the have a culture and environment and systems and processes that are going to be equitable and supportive of everyone.
Thank you. You know, one of the things I used to always say in my last role during the pandemic is, never let a good crisis go to waste. So, I mean, from crisis maybe comes opportunity. What, as we think about, particularly for folks who are joining the call today, maybe they're current students who are considering employment after HGSE, or they're folks out in the workforce who are considering a change. Like, What opportunities are you seeing in the talent space? Let's start. We'll start with Rachel.
Sure, yeah. Well, we're seeing a lot of leadership change in sort of the top executive positions at organizations, and we've seen that for the last year or two. And so that often means, if you're thinking about the life cycle of an organization, that there's a strategic planning that's happening, and strategic plans drive hiring. And so that means there is a lot of openings, I think, coming down the pike, especially in organizations that are having new presidents, new executive directors.
What about you, Rebecca? What are some opportunities you're seeing?
I'm thinking, I mean, I was thinking like across the board, just are there more talent roles, right? Are there more HR roles? And I mean, I don't see it dropping. I also don't see a flood, right? I think what we saw in the last few years is definitely an increase in like chief diversity officers, like a real focus on DEI specific roles, which I hope will continue. Again, I think we've seen a little bit of, unfortunately, a drop off, particularly with sort of broader layoffs and that sort of thing, which isn't a great trend. But I do think I think the theme that is continuing is this acknowledgement that nurturing talent cannot be a sort of side gig, right? It needs to be front and center, and there needs to be real strategy behind that. And so having roles that do that, I mean, I think that can come in the form of talent. I think I've also seen some like chief of staff type roles that have components of talent in it. And then certainly diversity roles. And so I think we'll continue to see that. There's a lot of talk around, well, I might be jumping. I was going to say AI and sort of will AI take jobs and that sort of thing. I think one of the plus side of talent roles is it's such a, there's so many soft skills required in an HR or talent type role. I don't think the bots will take our jobs in that sense. Maybe some of the sort of more granular grunt work, but so I think those skills are just really needed more than ever as we continue to move forward.
Thanks. Yeah. Well, I want to hear from Cornelius, and then we'll come back to the AI question briefly. Cornelius, what opportunities do you see?
If I put myself in the same seat as a recent grad, I just had a very myopic view of what talent was. And so I thought of talent as pretty much two things. One was either talent acquisition, so you were doing like the recruitment selection part of it, or like compliance, so more benefits related. And those things are both very important parts of talent. But going back to the talent lifecycle, talent is so expansive. I would say benefits and compliance is such a very small part of what I do, but it's mostly my current organization really wanted a head of talent to think about some of the things that I think Rebecca, Rachel, what we've been talking about is like, how do we build a culture that's inclusive, that's equitable? How do we think of things strategically through a DEI type lens? And so I spend a lot of my time actually, it feels like in strategy related meetings, thinking about really the infrastructure of the organization from a people perspective. And that's really exciting to think about that being where talent heads. I think the same organization probably 5 years ago would have actually thought about talent a bit more traditionally. And what I'm seeing is organizations sort of rethink the importance of talent given this retention issue that we're talking about, that it can't be a side piece. It has to be something that's integral to what the organization does. Like its external programming or its external strategy has to match what it does internally. So I'm seeing, at least in my LinkedIn feed, all sorts of interesting talent like roles that aren't just related to acquisition. I'm seeing professional development or development roles, more culture related roles, or that being part of talent, like talent and culture, to signal that it's just not about the acquisition, but it is about kind of the talent or the cultural kind of ecosystem in the organization.
Thanks. At the risk of sort of stepping through the third wall here, I think, but also sitting in a school operator, I guess a couple things I would sort of add that I'm seeing is definitely, I think, still opportunities in kind of responding to long-term impacts of the pandemic. So we're doing a lot more investment, not just on like employee well-being, but just generally on like staff and student wellness, investments in mental health. There's obviously one of the challenges that we're sort of looking ahead to, or the financial implications of a loss of federal funding that really propped a lot of this up during the pandemic. But we are also thinking about what is the role. I think in part because we were founded, we're sort of a technology enabled kind of focus on innovation organization. We have been thinking a lot about the role of AI and how it will impact not only my work in talent, but how it'll impact our work generally. I'd love to hear if anybody has, and I'll just open it up. If anybody has anybody on the panel has any ideas about or any thoughts on how AI will impact talent, your work in the future, or is already impacting your work, and how you see it impacting work in your organization or in the sector more broadly. Rebecca, you want to start us off?
I can kick us off. Yeah, I do not claim to be an expert in AI by any means. So I'm just what I think I have noticed is in terms of recruiting and looking at resumes and doing the talent acquisition side, like the reality of people using ChatGPT, using that type of technology to support writing resumes, to support writing cover letters, to use that as a tool. Like I think that is just a standard thing out there, and so just being mindful of how to use that tool, right? And I think it can really be supportive and helpful. And also, I think as we talk so much about in education spaces, like just that critical lens, right, of the pros and cons of it. Similarly, I mean, I think if you're job searching and if you're doing a pretty expansive search, and again, this may be more across sectors, not just education sector, but the reality of I think the resume screening, and if like AI is helping support doing those screenings, that just means it's like harder to kind of get your resume to the top of the pile or have like human eyes on it. And so I think just thinking about like how are you tailoring your resume, how are you sort of standing out, that sort of thing. So I think it is, I'm seeing it play mostly in the talent acquisition realm right now. Like I'm not sort of seeing it trickle through to other spaces. When it starts to trickle through in terms of I don't know, if it starts to trickle into more of like the development space of how do we develop humans and support humans, that's where I get nervous. But I've seen it mostly that phase right now.
Thanks, Rebecca. Anybody else want to add anything? Rachel?
Yeah, AI doesn't really come into play with my work right now because it's very custom. That's sort of the value proposition of a search firm. But I think that you can use it if you're a job seeker in practicing interview questions, and that might help you feel a little bit more comfortable, especially if you haven't done a lot of interviewing or haven't done it recently.
I would just add to what Rachel is saying, more on the interviewee side. I find it also to be an interesting equity tool. So some folks have more access to maybe resume coaching, and maybe the interview coaching, like that's something that you can opt into. And sometimes you could actually get a coach in that way. And some folks, that's not a resource. And what I've seen early career professionals do is sort of use it for those purposes. And I think that's really helpful. To just add to what Rachel said, like whether that's practicing interviews or helping to organize your thoughts in a cover letter, right? Like if you're on the hiring side, you're not going to get duped by a cover letter, right? Like you're going to be asking questions and whatnot. But if that helps, especially our early career professionals, be able to organize their thoughts or practice interview questions, I think it's a tool for good use.
Mhm. Yeah, thanks. One thing that I would add that I'm seeing is or that just I'm experiencing directly in my organization is we are assuming now that like any application, any elements of the application that require like written responses are probably being generated by AI. So like we've eliminated all like application questions. We've eliminated the requirement of a cover letter. Um, and if roles, I think there's an argument to be made for eliminating those things anyways, unless like written communication is a core part of the job. But when it is a core part of the role, the expectations for the role, we're asking folks to do writing in person. Um, um, and part of that too is also just or asking folks to acknowledge when they're using, if they're using AI for any sort of written exercise. One more question for this group, and then I'll open it up to see if we got any questions from the audience. What are when you think about the roles that the positions for which you're currently hiring, or across functions, what are some of the skills and qualifications that you are looking for, or that you see kind of in high demand today? And have those changed at all in the last few years as a result of kind of everything, all the disruption and evolution we've seen in this landscape? Why don't I start with Rachel on that one?
Sure. The first thing that comes to mind is what used to be referred to as soft skills. I don't think people use that so much anymore because it makes it sound like it's secondary, but really thinking about flexibility, the ability to influence others, and folks who take a real culture lens to the way they show up at work. And a lot of times that comes with, I guess I'd describe it as cultural humility. And then secondly, I think folks who are able to demonstrate impact in the positions that they've held.
Thanks, Rachel. Cornelius, what about you? What are you seeing in terms of skills, qualifications?
This is a tricky word because of the kind of organization I work for, which is very specialized. But we are hiring right now for a role, and this has come up in terms of what's actually required and what's nice to have, and being able to differentiate between that, because that'll allow you to widen the funnel of candidates. And it's thinking about what can be coached on the role. So being able to assess adaptability. So I think similar to what Rachel was saying, can this person get coached quickly? Even if they might have some gaps, and might that actually help us widen the funnel? And so we've developed our performance tests to actually give real-time coaching to see how someone will respond to it. And so based off of their responses and real-time feedback on a task, because sometimes performance tasks are very one-sided, at least it feels that way. Someone presents a performance task and it's sort of assessed versus being able to engage in conversation. And so thinking about the interview process as a way to actually test out some of those soft skills, not in like a response way, but in an interactive way, to see if someone could fit this role. They may not fit exactly the technical skills part of it. They have to have some foundation of that, but might they be able to come into the role and be coached or catch up quickly? And how do you assess the ability to be able to do that so you're not losing out on good candidates?
Rebecca, what about you?
Yeah, so I think some of the things in the various roles that we've recruited for at Mindshare Partners, there are a few things that are underlying that we look for regardless of the function or the type of position it is. And one of those things is learning orientation. So what is your level, like what is your desire to learn, to recognize mistakes as opportunities to grow and change, to be self-aware, So really just having that appetite for continuous learning and growth. We also, I will say that project management like continues to be like foundational. And I don't mean that in the sense of you have to go out and get a project management certificate, but like your ability to organize yourself, your ability to like get work done, to break things down into steps and make sure that you're able to accomplish that. And, you know, I think sometimes that type of thing is sort of overlooked, right? Like it's sort of like an obvious thing. Well, of course someone can get work done, but really having solid project management skills and being able to execute it again, demonstrate that you were able to accomplish things, I think is really important. And then just, you know, I would say, we're often looking for sort of like entrepreneurialism in the sense of like self-starter, like if you're not sure what to do or you're not sure how to do it, particularly for us as a smaller, like kind of more scrappy organization, like, you know, do you have the willingness to go and like figure it out? I don't know. So I'm going to go research and try something out. So I think those are a few things that that we have looked for. And again, that's a little bit specific to us being a small organization, but I think those can be pretty cross-cutting in terms of foundational skills that are important to have as you walk into any role.
Great, thank you. Thanks, everyone. I wanna open it up to any questions from the audience. If you wanna either put your questions in the chat or you can come off mute and ask them. I've got more. I can keep going if I.
I can chime in with a question. Right?
Great. Yeah. Thanks. Thanks, Erica.
Thanks for joining. My name's Erica. I'm an alum from the class of 2020. And question for you all is like, are there any resources or go-to, whatever it might be for you that you tend to draw upon for your own, you know, continued growth and learning or just staying up to date in the sort of area? I'm sure some of it comes from just being in the field, doing the work day to day and having your own networks built in the space, but would love to hear if there are any, I don't know, resources, podcasts, websites, influencers you follow, whatever it might be, just to stay up to date.
I can kick us off. This is definitely kind of HR specific. I definitely use SHRM as a resource. So I have a membership and that is a go-to for lots of different looking up information. I'm also a member of the Talent Collaborative Google group, which is I don't even know how large it is, but it's just a whole bunch of talent people throwing out a lot of different resources. That's a good one. And then, you know, I do try and sort of follow, you know, one recent newsletter that I started following is it's called I Hate It Here, actually. And it's called, what is her name? I'm totally blanking on her name. Ryan, help me. I think you're muted.
I'm gonna have to look it up too, but yes,
yeah, I'll put it in the
I
chat.
also really
anyhow,
enjoy her.
but it's
I'm
an interesting
employee engagement.
Yeah, it's an interesting commentary on HR work. So those are a few things that I follow. I'll put it in there.
Thanks, Rebecca. Rachel or Cornelius, anybody you're reading, following, listening to?
I think the Harvard Business Review got a subscription there. I think they have some really great resources. Adam Grant, I'm a huge fan of Adam Grant. So his podcast also, if you're looking for something shorter, great to follow him on social media. And then Lily Zhang, if you're more like DEI and talent, they wrote a book called DEI Deconstructed and just did a follow-up to that, DEI Reconstructed. And it talks about the intersection of DEI and talent specifically. And those are some of my go-to resources.
Much of the same that Cornelius and Rebecca shared. I also live on LinkedIn because I'm a recruiter. And so I do just sometimes scroll my LinkedIn feed and my network, you know, really populates a lot of interesting and helpful content for me.
Yeah. The only thing I would add is I would plus one a lot of the resources folks have already mentioned. I I am also I'm big on like group learning, like cohort based. So like I'm also part of a couple of lists. I'm on like a charter talent leader list that is like the most active Google group I've ever been part of. And I refer back to a lot of the resources from HGSE. I took Monica Higgins' course. I took, Ron Heifetz's course, Dean Williams's course. I took a course on group learning, which I don't think it's taught by the same. I'm not sure if it's even taught there anymore. Like adult development. So I refer back. Bob Keegan, refer back to a lot of those resources still. And found them like to be hugely helpful.
This is helpful. Thanks. I'll appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks.
Me think of too when I was graduating, I do remember the Career Center had some like massive list of like top or education organizations. I'm sure it's evolved, but I wonder if there's a version of that now. Like I remember like saving it, and then I would like sort of comb through all those organizations to look for jobs and be like, what's happening with these places? So that was a very helpful resource at the time.
That's right. Another question for the panel from me. What just as we like kind of start to wind down, how can candidates stand out right now when you think about like folks who are maybe interested in making a change and applying for a new role? Like how can candidates stand out, whether that's in their application or in their interview? Any tips for like for folks on this call who might be in that position? Let's why don't we start with Cornelius?
This is such a subjective question.
Yeah,
Because I think what would stand out to me might be different to Rachel and Rebecca on the hiring side of it. But I like creativity. And so thinking about and I try to form performance task or interviews that way that allows for a lot of latitude for that, just to see what candidates are willing to do. And I've gotten some really creative applications that were sometimes written in the form of poems or visuals or videos, and try to make the directions fairly loose. And that can be frustrating to some, but really exciting to others. And so I would say, even if you're not asked to do that, what are ways that you, especially because it's a people related field, so how can you emphasize your own humanity in the interview process? I also think when folks kind of make themselves vulnerable to the extent that that feels comfortable for them and show up as like real humans and say pieces of themselves that draw them to this work, like I'm impressed by that. Like I think especially in people work, you got to be real, you got to be vulnerable, you got to be human to do this work. And I think that those are things that at least stand out to me when I'm going through the acquisition process with candidates.
Thanks, Cornelius. Rachel, what about you?
I love what Cornelius just shared. I wish that were applicable in my industry. I definitely think candidates can stand out by doing their homework and making sure that their communications are tailored to what they're applying to. And communications can be cover letters, resumes, of course, but also your email outreach or LinkedIn messaging to contacts at the organization or the recruiter. And along those lines, if you're tailoring your application materials, do keep in mind that you can have multiple versions of your resume depending on what type of institution you're targeting for employment or what type of job, if you are open to multiple types of work.
Thanks, Rachel. Rebecca, what about you?
I would add, I think what's interesting to me in like interviewing a bunch of folks over the years is that I still see a lot of really talented candidates be really long-winded in their storytelling, to be honest. Like, and I would say, so like practice, first of all, like grab your stories. Like your stories are so helpful, right? I don't know if it's like the STAR method or whatever you think about the situation or what you're asked to do or what your results are, but come up with your stories, but really practice telling it in a succinct but compelling way, and I think that can really go a long way in towards just helping the recruiter be really clear about what are the types of things that you're good at and have done, and really getting a good understanding of you as a candidate.
Well, thank you. I'll take the liberty to answer this question too. I think, everything that you've all shared resonates with me. I think, I think because of a lot of what we've talked about in terms of disruption, in terms of how people are making decisions about where they work and where they choose to stay, like understanding your why and like really understanding your whys as best you can, like why this job, why this industry, why this organization, because this work, whether it's like working at any one of our 3 organizations or any one of our 4 organizations or the number of organizations out in the sector, like this work is hard. And it can be hard. And so understanding why you're there and why not Deloitte or McKinsey or Goldman Sachs or something else where you're going to make a lot more money. Yes, totally. Thank you. Incredibly rewarding. And if I think it's rewarding if you feel like the work sustains you. And I think the work sustains you if you're clear on why you're doing it. Or it's more likely to sustain you. So that would be like, why is learning and development important to you? Or why is it important to you to work in K-12? Or why is it important to you to work in the nonprofit sector generally, regardless of what that space, regardless of what services you provide. So I want to thank everybody for being here. We're coming up on 10 o'clock on the West Coast, 1 o'clock on the East Coast. I want to thank everybody for joining today. It was great to see so many folks on the call. Really want to thank the panelists too for your insights and your time. All the panelists have also expressed their willingness to share their resumes. So share their emails. So we'll all put our email addresses in the chat. And I know that any one of us would be happy to speak further about anything that's on your mind, or if you want to learn more about one of our organizations. So thanks very much. Again, really appreciate the time, and hope you all have a great rest of the week.
Thank you so much, Ryan, Rebecca, Rachel, Cornelius. We really appreciate your insight and advice. And an email will be going out with this session recording and with the panelists' email addresses probably later this week. So everyone, please look out for that. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks.
Mm.